Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Exit Pursued by Bard, the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival's podcast/video interview webinar series. I'm joined today with Ciarán Barata-Hynes, the
Hello.
writer, actor, no, I've run out of director, person who has been in many things. Hello, Ciarán.
Hello. I have that on my business card. Ciarán Barata-Hynes, person who has been in many things.
It's like Jack of all trades, but far less specific.
Yeah.
Um,
It,
yeah, so introduce yourself, Ciarán. When did you join CSF?
um. Right. Hello. I'm Ciarán. I joined. Introduce myself as like there's people there. I guess there kind of is. Right. So I was part of the first ever CSF. I was called up on the phone. I remember I was walking down the street. It was a sunny day. I think it was May or something like that. And I got called up on the phone by my good friend Philip, who was directing a version of Romeo and Juliet that had to be put together in a week, basically. And they didn't have enough parts. And so he called me up and was like, Ciarán, please help. Will you please come to Canterbury and be in my Romeo and Juliet? And I remember giving him a one sentence response saying, only if I can be Tybalt. Having like not read Romeo and Juliet in a long time, completely forgetting that Tybalt had about 11 lines. And then later discovering that Philip originally wanted me to play Lord Capulet and being like, oh God, what have I done? That would have been way more fun. And so I remember having up my lines as much as possible to at least like squeeze every drop out of my stage time.
Because
Um,
Tybalt dies halfway through, or not even before the interval, really, doesn't he?
it's basically right before the interval. It's Benvolio. Yeah, that's it. But not Benvolio, the other one,
Mercutio.
Mercutio. Mercutio dies, and then Tybalt comes back for some reason, and then Romeo kills him, and that's where we had the intervals. I lay on stage
Oh, yes.
dead throughout the entire interval, so that when the play started up again, my family could come and be like, "Oh, he's dead." And I remember in one of the performances, it was so hot because it was like the end of July or the beginning of August. I can't remember exactly when. But it was so hot that I got heat stroke, basically, having lied in the sun for the entirety of the interval. And when I finally got backstage, I was like, I can't see. And
At least you weren't in the second half until weren't you? Weren't you in the tomb scene?
yeah, I came back as like a ghost. Basically, they didn't know what to do about. They had these two sort of like placard things. What you call those? Those like wooden crate things.
Yeah, like little soapbox things, weren't they?
Yeah, those. Yeah, they had a couple of those to be like the sarcophagi, I suppose, of the people in the Capulet crypt, and they didn't know how to get them on because they were carrying Juliet in on hers, and so I was going to already be there. And so I just sort of, before they came in, I just sort of carried mine on and sort of acted ghostly and solemn and creepy. So it became like dramaturgical relevance as opposed to just, someone dragging on a wooden plaque thing
And then lying down.
and then lying down. I remember that one of the performances, I think 3 people turned up, which is quite funny because before the performance started, when nobody was there, we all thought that if no one showed up, we were still going to go through the play, but we were allowed to basically do whatever we wanted. Um, and me being me, I had decided that if no one showed up to the play, this bit where I come in dragging my placard, I was going to do the entirety of the "This is the winter of our discontent" speech. Just because I didn't get any lines. So,
It's a good.
yeah,
So that was the first year, and then in the second year, you were in Merchant of Venice, you were in Macbeth, but you also wrote Iago. So tell us a bit about Iago.
um, so what happened was I was in China the year leading up to the second Merchant of Venice, sorry, the second Canterbury Shakespeare Festival. That tells you what part I remember the best. Um, and there was this like contract dispute. I won't go into details, but basically they wanted me to stay a month longer, which meant I would have missed a lot of rehearsal time for CSF. And originally that was not what I had signed up for. And so there was this whole contract dispute. And while this was sort of going on, I had this idea of rejigging Othello to focus on the character of Iago, because I've always loved Iago. I think a lot of people do. He's a fantastic villain. He's a lot of fun, but at the same time, he's not a very good like character, in the sense that he's very two-dimensional. Like, there's no reason why he's this evil, right? Like, he is supremely and profoundly malevolent to like the extent that just doesn't make any sense why he hates Othello so much that he's willing to like completely ruin his life in this nefarious and underhanded way. He doesn't, he could poison him or, stab him in the back one night, but he decides to like methodically and systematically ruin his life to the point where Othello like basically he falls in love with Iago and murders his wife because Iago said so. And so I decided to try and like reshuffle the play in some way in order to make Iago feel more like an actual person, and then quickly discovered that there wasn't enough text there to do that. And so I was like, well, if I rewrite, or rather than rewrite, if I add in some stuff, then I think I can make this work. And I remember speaking to Ben, the creative director at the time, and being like, so I have this mad idea of doing this play of messing around with Othello, and he was like, that sounds really cool. If you do the script, I will get you a night somewhere. We'll find a night to do this. If you can get a script together and you can get a cast and all the rest of it, I will find a venue to put you on for one night. So yeah, that was basically just the sort of the inception of the whole thing.
Which in turn kind of became the inception of the experimental show that we had every year since. It's kind of been the kickstart of that. So it's all your fault.
It's all my fault. You have to worry about that every year.
We can lay that firmly at your door. We did it in the Shakespeare pub, didn't we? In their kind of little courtyard.
Yes, you were my what's the
Brabantio.
But that's his name, the father. Yes. We did it in the Shakespeare Beer Garden. I remember one of the best things about the experience was about 4 people came up to me afterwards who said, we had no idea there was a play on here tonight. And when it started, we were thinking of leaving. But then it was actually really good, so we stayed. I was like, oh, yay. I remember we all had our scripts in our hands, but we tried to, I tried to rejig it so that it was part of the performance, because the play dealt with not just Othello and Iago, but also with villainy in general in Shakespeare. There was like this mask that appeared, and when Iago put the mask on, he became the villain Iago as opposed to like the man Iago. And the mask sort of like demanded of him the evil required to finish the play, basically. And then some of the other characters at points put the mask on and they became villains from other Shakespeare plays. And so it was very meta, and it dealt with the whole thing. And so we had these bound scripts, which we sort of gesticulated with and acted with. And whenever somebody died, the character killing them would tear their script up as like a...
Hence it was only one night.
Yeah, and since it was only one night, we was able to do. I remember the bit where Othello strangles Desdemona, him like slowly pulling pages out of her script as she died, and that being actually really effective. It worked way better than it had any right to. Like, I remember being like, well, we'll try and make this work, and then by the end of the show, being like, I think people actually bought that was like planned all along.
There's people watching this now going, wait a minute, what? They feel cheated.
No, it's just because we didn't have enough time to learn all our lines.
I learned one of my lines because I remember I had to give my script to Othello as if I was giving him my daughter, and then I still had a line afterwards which I had to learn. And it was on that basis that I got cast as Brabantio the next year, because they're like, you knew the lines. And I was like, no, I didn't. I knew one line. I knew one line, Ben. Or Tom, actually. It was
Amazing.
Tom. And then third year, you played Brutus and Julius Caesar, and then you also wrote, starred, and co-directed Shakespeare's Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah. I mean, I had the second most amount of lines, and the thing is that I wouldn't say that I starred in it, and this is just a bugbear of mine, because the part that I played, though on stage a lot, what isn't very impactful. I kind of play the sort of narrator
You kind of the
part.
chorus.
Yeah, kind of like the chorus, and I played William Shakespeare in it because the framing device of Thatcher is that Shakespeare in the afterlife has a dinner party where he's gathered a bunch of famous dead people to read his new play, which is The Tragic History of Margaret Thatcher. But I played him almost, he was very doddery and anxious, and it wasn't really like a starring part. He kind of drowns under the personalities of everybody else who was there, which is one of the reviews we got when we took it to London was attacked me for directing, writing, and starring in it, and not giving a tour de force performance. Being like, oh,
Kenneth Branagh spoiled them, clearly.
yeah. But yeah, so after the second year, Ben came to me, I think, and asked if I had any ideas for another experimental Shakespeare thing, and that we would put it on as part of the festival proper, And so I was like, I've kind of got an idea. And so I wrote Shakespeare's Margaret Thatcher, which I'm glad that I had the festival and the sort of the boundaries of it, because it couldn't be longer than an hour and the rest of that. Because without that, it probably wouldn't exist. But in sort of looking back at it, I feel like the play itself suffers a lot for the constraints, and that if I was to ever do it again, I would take it apart and rewrite a significant amount of it and add to it. I think it needs to be at least 2 hours long. But yeah, it was an interesting experience. Again, we had to put it on in about a week, with a cast populated by people who were already in at least one other show. It was quite a bit of a nightmare, actually, getting Thatcher together, even more than Iago. And Iago, I remember I was getting up at about 8 a.m. to go rehearse at Iago for like an hour, and then I would perform Macbeth, and then we would have Merchant of Venice rehearsals late in the evening, and that was just my schedule for like a week and a half, and it was very tiring. But I'm not sure why Thatcher was just felt even worse. Yeah, it was very, very tiring, and the whole cast suffered a lot. I think people were very stressed that year about the lines and things like that. I think that was the big difference, is that for Thatcher, everyone had to learn their lines. We couldn't have our scripts in our hands, and it was that more than anything that was really stressing us out, because rehearsals became very tough in people forgetting their lines. And yes, I co-directed it with Amy Hendry because we needed some eyes in the audience. I mean, originally I didn't want to be in it at all. I wanted to just direct it, but there were two parts that I refused to gender bend, and that was William Shakespeare, who also plays Ronald Miller, and Dorothy Parker, who also plays Margaret Thatcher. And there literally weren't any guys who would do the show, because they were all busy doing other shows. And so my options were to either gender bend that part or I play it. And I decided that I would just do it, because I wrote it, so I knew a lot of the lines, and it was the second most amount of lines in the show, so it just became easier to do it. And then when we did it in London, again, we had about a month to put it together, because this is a tangent, but basically a slot opened up at this theatre, and they were like, we've had a cancellation, does anyone have a show? And we didn't think that we'd get the slot, but we did, and then we had to just smash it together again in about a month.
It was the Drayton Arms, wasn't it?
Yes, the Drayton Arms Pub Theatre.
Yeah, it was. I think it's also the Iago and Thatcher kind of And Claudius was that year as well, wasn't it? It was the same
Yeah.
year. It kind of consolidated the idea of the experimental show and kind of the way that we now treat them as, in terms of time frame, the same as the other shows. So they all get pitched at the same time, they get chosen at the same time, they get cast at the same time, and it kind of integrates them better into the festival. Then you weren't around for the fourth year, but fifth year you played Hamlet, and then sort of the tail end of the fifth year, what would have been the sixth year, you wrote Magna Carta,
Yeah.
which was the last thing any of us have ever done. Um,
It's the last play ever.
well, until we start again.
Of course.
Exactly. So tell us a bit about Magna Carta. How did that kind of come about as a concept?
Um, so I like, as you can probably tell, I like history, and I like bad guys. Um, and I became briefly fascinated with the character of King John. I can't remember what it was that I was reading, but I just, yeah, he just sort of came into my mind's eye a lot, and I decided that I was going to read the King John Shakespeare play, right? Because I thought that it's one of the very niche ones. It's not very well known. It's not performed a lot, and I was like, I wonder why. And so I read it, and it's not great, and it doesn't mention the Magna Carta even once, uh, which was when I was like, well, this can't stand. Like, this can't be. There can't be a play about King John that doesn't talk about the Magna Carta.
Especially because isn't it? It's about the Barons' Revolt quite heavily. Isn't it?
The Baron's Revolt is mentioned in it. There's a whole arc in the play that involves the Baron's Revolt, but the reasons they revolt are completely different, and the way that it is settled is also completely different. I think that Shakespeare just sort of made stuff up, probably because he didn't want to be seen to be questioning
The power of a monarch.
well, not just that, but to questioning the government in general, and also reminding the monarchy of the time they lost supreme power over everything.
Probably not a great idea.
No. So then I started thinking about wanting to write a play about the Magna Carta, and thinking of like trying to smash a few different things together, like the King John and a few other like film scripts and whatnot. And then I just thought,
Disney's Robin Hood, obviously.
pardon?
Disney's Robin Hood, obviously.
This is Robin Hood, of
The,
course.
the primary choice for any King John.
Delicious taxes. Yeah, and then just deciding, forget it. I'm just going to write my own thing, because it would be more effort to try and collage all these different scripts together and make them sound like cohesive and the rest of it. And I decided to keep it in iambic pentameter, and sort of Shakespearean style verse, because Iago had like probably about 30 to 40% original verse in there. And then Thatcher was half and half, because the scenes at the dinner party were plain script, and then the scenes in the Thatcher play were written as Shakespeare had written it. And so this was the first time that I was writing a full script, just me, in that style of writing. And I feel like my idea originally was to make this like big sort of epic, this big sweeping epic about King John and the Magna Carta. But I wanted it to start out with him being sat at the table where the Magna Carta is, and deciding whether to sign it or not. And I remember writing all the way up to probably what was 90% of what would end up being the finished script, and sort of stopping and being like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go from here. Rah, 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 rah. And then realizing, I think it's almost finished. I think that's why. And it turned out to, rather than be this sort of grand sweeping epic, it turned out to be closer to the very original inception in my head, was to do this very microscopic look at King John's psyche, and to write this very cerebral play about, power and the right to rule and theology and divine right and all the rest of it. And that's what it turned out to be, this sort of like just under to just over an hour piece where it's just this sort of like focused lens on King John. And it was, of all the plays that I've written, the least sort of populist one. Like, it's not for everybody. It's like, I would struggle to say that it's particularly entertaining. I like to think it's quite interesting. But it is very much like, here is King John, here are some arguments about the nature of power for an hour. That's it. So yeah, that's how that came about.
I remember one of my favourite audience reactions was this couple who were having a proper fight after kind of once the applause had died down. One of them was going, "Well, I think King John was all right," and the other ones, then they had a proper argument, and they were like, I had to ask them to leave at one point because we'd finished, we'd tidied up, but they were still there arguing.
That's
And they were
amazing. I didn't realize this.
Yeah, and then they were staying at the hotel, and they went upstairs, and then they came back and through the bar, and I overheard their conversation. They were still talking about it, and they went in the hot tub, and I'm hoping that they just kept arguing about it all night. I really
They are heard to still be arguing this day.
Turns out it was actually just his ghost. So yeah, that's kind of your history in CSF. So why do you think Shakespeare's important? And what do you what is it that you like about him, about the work that isn't King John?
Um, well, I think on one level, which is something that you don't see necessarily being discussed, is that Shakespeare is important because we've sort of just decided that he is, he's a cultural staple at this point. He's, one of the secular gods of British culture and of sort of like the literary English canon, internationally speaking. And at this point, I'm not sure how much we can remove the myth of Shakespeare from the actual body of the work. And because he's so ingrained in so many people's minds, and his work is done and redone over and over again, and it's also just even aside from historians and writers and sort of literary scholars in general, he's very important amongst acting and of course theatre craft. There are certain people who would say you're not a real actor till you've done at least one Shakespeare play. That sort of elitist rhetoric goes on a lot. And, I agree to some extent, that I think it's important to, perform widely and attempt different things. But yeah, I think he's important because he just sort of is at this point. And I think that means that if you're going to throw your hat into the ring of culture, whether it be as an actor or a writer or an artist or whatever, I think that it's important to grapple with the things that society has decided are important, and then make your own mind up about them. Whether you come away being like, nah, Shakespeare's naff, man, like I don't see the point, or you come away being like, yeah, that's really affected me in a profound way. That's up to you. So I think he's important in that sense, that he's one of these sort of like staples of culture that should be at least experienced. And the general consensus is that there is a lot of worth within Shakespeare. And I personally think there is. He's one of the few writers of that time who deal with what you could describe as real people stories, he was definitely there with Mozart in the ring of, not all stories need to be
About the
entirely centered on the gentry and myth, classic myth. I mean, even Kit Marlowe, probably the second most famous contemporary of his most famous work literally includes the devil. And there's lots of writing around that time that is just, it's proper mythology, fantasy writing. And Shakespeare, for all the kings and queens that are involved, there's also just stories about people trying to not have sex, and you know, stories about capitalism and prejudice and all the rest of it. I think that's one of the reasons why he is important. And even today, you know, I feel like there is this tussle between, you know, modern myth making stuff like the MCU, and these sort of like human stories, you know, like your classic Channel 4, or your sponsored by the British Lottery film, stuff like Fish Tank, things like that. And I think that both of them are important. And I feel like the best stuff is things that incorporate both of those styles of storytelling. And I think Shakespeare is one of the few people, at least one of the few revered in the canon, who manages to do that, who has, especially in his later work, stories like The Tempest, and Macbeth, which are very much about, you know, magic and power and mythology, but they're also about PTSD and toxic relationships and just very human emotions. And on a third level, I think that he's important, and this is sort of the pompous writer in me talking. I think he's important because of the kind of language he uses, and that's not necessarily to say that writing that way is inherently better or inherently worth more than writing in a different way, in a naturalistic sense, or in a different kind of heightened dialogue. But I think that nowadays writing in verse is very much fallen out of fashion. I think it's coming back a little bit now, in the last sort of 10-15 years, and how unfashionable it has been for the last sort of like 50 years in stuff like Charles III was famously written in verse, and there's some other works that are like that. But I think it's important to kind of try and keep that flame alive, because when done well, I think it's a really beautiful thing. And from the perspective of a writer and of an actor, it's not only challenging, but it's sort of nourishing to the soul, I think, to work on a text that's written like this, to sort of let the poet in you fly a little bit. And of course, you have to, you can't forget that the audience, you know, buying tickets and actually having a good time is the be all and end all of theatre. And so I think it's right that this doesn't dominate the market, and that if you're going to do something like this, it better be bloody good, because otherwise people are going to get bored real quick. But to have some of this still there,
Hmm.
and to have people, you know, especially when they're working on their craft, trying to experiment and the rest of it, to have people feel like this is an avenue they can try and pursue, I think is important.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Something that occurred to me. So, how kind of does one sit down and write a play in verse? How
Um,
did you do it? Is it a case of writing out what you want to say, and then rewriting it in verse? Does it come quite naturally?
so I'm quite lucky in that I've had a sort of informal education in doing it, this kind of like uh, informal apprenticeship, having worked with CSF and then done these three plays, Iago and Thatcher and Magna Carta. The process has changed a lot. And I was assisted greatly by being immersed in working with these texts outside of writing. So we discussed, I played Tybalt, and then the next year I played Shylock and Duncan, and then I played Brutus and Hamlet, and so I've become very familiar with the style, and the sort of like the particulars of how it works, and the text themselves, like the content therein. With Iago, what happened was I took Othello, and you know, I started editing it, and whenever I wanted to write a new bit, I basically didn't really write in verse so much as I wrote in old timey fancy talk, right? And for the most part, most audience members are not going to know the difference, so long as it's like nice, old-timey fancy talk. And there's an occasional couplet in there at the end of a speech or what have you. And then I remember going back over it and trying to put at least some of the soliloquies, the dialogue for the most part that I wrote and knew. I didn't go back and try to put it into iambic. But the soliloquies, at least to an extent, I tried to do that in editing. And I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is that not all of Shakespeare's writing is in iambic pentameter. A lot of it is not. Even the stuff that is still written in verse is not always perfectly iambic. I mean, one of the most famous lines of all of Shakespeare, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Like it breaks pentameter right at the end there. He cheats, and it sometimes it sounds better to cheat than not to. And you can get all into the sort of the theory of linguistic crafting and how that affects meaning if you want to, and talk about that sort of stuff, but we don't really have time. So yeah, that was how I did Iago. And then with Thatcher, I decided that I was gonna write in the whole thing, like in verse, the Thatcher scenes, as opposed to just write fancy times. And so I started writing in the thin columns as opposed to just like in the regular text. But even then, I was more trying to sort of craft the rhythm of verse as opposed to sticking the fine lines of iambic pentameter. And I remember having to go back over some of it to try and make it fit more rigidly. And there was a lot of cheating and cutting out syllables and replacing them with an apostrophe and stuff. And a few of the conversations suffered for that. But that was very much more of a technical pursuit of trying to get it to fit inside the margins of iambic pentameter. And by the time I came to writing Magna Carta, I found that I was just doing it, that I didn't even have to really count on my hands the syllables anymore, that I would just be writing it, and then I would go back over it and be like, da na 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 na. Oh yeah, it's already there. And I proudly can say that I think, apart from times when I've intentionally broken, I think there is a speech in there that's intentionally written in prose, like analogous to like when Brutus does his pre-Romans countryman speech that's written in prose. There's a speech in there that's written like that. But apart from that, I'm pretty sure all of Magna Carta is iambic pentameter, which might be an over achievement, kind of. Like, I feel like I was like, haha, look at that, take that, Shakespeare. And then in retrospect, I think some of the dialogue actually suffers for it, that I was going more for technical feat than for like actual comprehensible language. So yeah, that's basically how that happened.
No, that's an interesting trajectory of kind of learning how to do the craft there. That's really interesting. I'm going to ask one last question, which I've asked everybody, but I've never warned anyone about it, so it's a bit of a wild card. But if you had access to play any part in Shakespeare, regardless of you being you, which part would you choose and why?
See, I want to say Richard III, but I feel like I have the opportunity to actually play Richard III at some point in my life. And if this is the only access to the magic transforming goo that will allow me to play anyone, I don't know. Right off the bat, the first thing my brain said was Coriolanus's mother.
Oh, that's a good Volumnia, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great part. You just
Great
get to
part.
tell him off, and she gets some great little monologues. Let's see if I can think of anything else interesting.
I don't know. I think Volumnia is a really, really
Good answer.
yeah, it's a really good answer to go with. Because I think when Charlotte and I did this, we both said Richard III. So let's avoid constant repetition. Otherwise, when the festival does Richard III, there's going to be fights.
There's definitely going to be a fight, I think. We'll have to do an entirely Richard III season where we do 4 different versions of Richard III.
I've always wanted to do a version of Arturo Ui where the actor playing Ui changes as the character develops.
That's interesting.
I can't remember why I came up with that idea. There was a reason, but I can't think what it was. But no, let's go with Volumnia. That's a good answer, and it's it's a bit different. Well, thank you, Ciarán. Thank you for sharing that with us. I hope that everyone enjoyed that. It was quite an interesting look inside your mind, and I meant that as a compliment.
Yeah.
But
it's a compliment.
Good. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you all next week.